Alright, hi everyone. This is chapter 36 on plant nutrition. So if you are a farmer or you have any experience with growing plants, I think you'll find this chapter pretty interesting and maybe even have some good stuff to contribute to our discussion this week. So one of the things about plants that, again, makes them unique from animals and fungi is that they have to make all of their own food. So they synthesize their own nucleic acids. So the DNA and the RNA are made by the plant. Amino acids, enzymes, cofactors, and chlorophylls. All of these things have to be made essentially by the plant. In addition to just making glucose, which is, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen strung together, they also need all the raw materials to make the nucleic acids, amino acids, enzymes, and all of these things. So, nucleic acids require phosphate and nitrogens. Amino acids require a wide range of nitrogens and different elements. So, they have to get these things from ions and molecules that are in the soil. So, most of these nutrients are found at low and even really extremely low concentrations in the soils. Okay, so one way flow of water carries these nutrients up the xylem. So from the soil, it's where all of these materials are, these ions, and the xylem is going to move them up into, through the water, up through the plant. So essential nutrients, the term essential tells you that it's obviously important, so it's required for normal growth and reproduction of the plant. So most vascular plants have 17 essential elements, and these three elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, make up 96% of the dry mass of the plant. And that makes sense, judging by the fact that carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen make up glucose, and that's a very important sugar in breaking down for energy and ATP. So these essential nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients, can be obtained from three sources: water, air, and soil. So you want to recognize the distinction between what is a macronutrient and what is a micronutrient. So a macronutrient, these are elements in the soil that plants require in really large quantities. So if you look at the prefix macro means large and big. So these require lots of things. So the major components of nucleic acids, proteins, phospholipids are going to be very important. So when you look up what makes up these macromolecules, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, these are some of the big guys. And since they're so important, we consider them to be limiting nutrients. So that means that their availability is going to limit the plant's growth. So if there's not enough nitrogen, not enough phosphorus, not enough potassium, the plant will be stunted in its ability to grow properly. And in some cases, if there's not enough of this at all, the plant won't grow or even get started. There's a whole slew of other nutrients that are considered micronutrients that are required in small quantities. So these are the ones that are found in the soils. A lot of times, the soil can seem to be lacking in some micronutrients, but still support the plant's health, even if there's not a whole lot of it. So a lot of times these are cofactors that bind to specific enzymes and allow them to function. So things like iron, zinc, boron, copper, nickel, all of these elements that are going to be very important, and these are going to be vital to the plant's health, even though they're only required in small amounts. So you may recognize some of these things are found in fertilizers. So you can supplement the soil and provide, sometimes micronutrients and even sometimes macronutrients as well. All right, so here's a great table that summarizes the macronutrients on the left for the plants and then some micronutrients on the right. So just make sure, you recognize them. Obviously, you don't have to memorize this, but know kind of where to find it and what the difference is and the distinction and how these nutrients are used by plants. So here's a good figure as well that kind of shows you what it looks like when plants are lacking in some of these essential nutrients and things you can see. So if you have a garden, you notice things that are happening. A lot of times if you see, yellow leaves that are slanting inward, it means the plant is deficient in magnesium. All right, if it's deficient in phosphate, the leaves can be darker than usual. deficient in carbon dioxide, a white deposit, stunted growth, plants dying back, right? So all these things are going to limit the plant's ability to do photosynthesis in some cases, especially with carbon dioxide, but in other cases to do all of its other functions as well. So all of these nutrients do play a role, sometimes in a very large quantity, like is the case with our macronutrients, and sometimes in a small quantity, which is the case of our micronutrients. Okay. And there is our micronutrients. So these are all deficiencies in macronutrients, and here are some deficiencies in the micronutrients. Right? And these are things that a lot of times good fertilizers will improve this. So mobile nutrients such as nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus are readily transferred from older leaves to newer leaves when they're in short supply. So if we start to see a scarcity and deterioration of the older leaves, when you start to see the older leaves deteriorate, that generally reflects a scarcity. So what will happen here with these, when it's needed in one spot, the nutrients will actually move, via the xylem from an area of need. Some nutrients, though, are immobile. Calcium, iron, copper can remain tied up in older leaves and not move. Right? So just differences in the way that nutrients are kind of reshuffled around the plant. So mobile nutrients can go where they're needed and immobile cannot. All right, so soil is pretty cool, believe it or not. There's different types of soil, and we're going to look at some of those, clay soils and things like that. But, what is soil? It's a dynamic mixture of living and non-living components, and it's got layers. It's got, very fine particles. It's got big particles. The living part is, your worms and the detritus, things like that. But, so how do we get soil? Well, even sand is soil. Sand on the beach is soil. It's not great soil, and we'll talk about kind of what makes soil good, but how we get soil is from weathering. So weathering essentially turns solid rock into sand, silt, clay, and continuously breaks it down. So the first particles are formed by weathering, or gravel, sand, silt, and clay, like I said, and then as organisms begin to occupy the soil, then it becomes more fertile and becomes a really a great source for the plants. So as the organisms come in, they add a layer of decaying organic matter, and that is called humus. And humus forms when living things die and decay in the area. And then humus is a very important component of the soil because it provides the essential macronutrients from the organisms that die and are deposited in the humus. Not to be confused with hummus, which is the chickpea stuff you eat with crackers. You don't want to be eating any humus. You want to stick with your hummus. So here is a layer, looking at the layers of the soil and the soil depth. So you can kind of see where the humus is. It's the most fertile layer here, and it's where the roots and things like that are going to be mostly located for these grasses. And then some dive deeper to get to different nutrients that may be in the deeper layers. But if you look at kind of what's in the humus, right, lots and lots of dead and living organisms in there, microscopic organisms in there, and parasites and protists and bacteria and all those things are found in the humus, right? Very, very living, supportive of life layer. As you get deeper into the more rock layers, you don't see that diversity of life. So how do we get good soil versus bad soil? Well, it has to do with the proportions of the rock, the gravel, the sand, the silt, and the clay. So the ability of the roots to penetrate the soil is really important, because if the roots can't get in or the roots can't diversify, then the plant is not going to have enough surface area to harvest as many nutrients as it can. So if the soil is able to anchor the plant will be able to take up not only the nutrients but also water. And the type of soil affects the availability of oxygen as well for cellular respiration, because if you're not taking in the water, you're not getting the oxygen from the H2O to ultimately make energy for the plant, make ATP. So what factors affect the availability of nutrients and how well a plant can take them up? So 3 elements are required for plant growth to occur in the soil. So the elements, not three, the elements required for plant growth to occur is in the form of ions. So an ion, you might remember from chemistry, is a positively or negatively charged element. So some nutrients are available as elemental ions, such as potassium, positive ion, or chlorine, which is a negative ion. So we see this happening in the soil, and depending on if we're talking about, a really good solid clay soil, some of these ions are going to stick, and some of them are not going to be able to stick. So other nutrients are present as molecular ions, phosphate, nitrite. These are all nitrates. We're going to see they're all going to be nutrients that are going to be molecules. Molecular ions just means multiple elements put together. Right? And these are what the plant's going to take up. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about nutrients. This is different than water. This is nutrients. So that's sometimes students get confused. They think water is a nutrient. It's not. Water's water. The nutrients are the other ions that are going to be dissolved in the water. So let's throw some names to these. So an ion that has a negative charge is called an anion. Okay? An anion is any ion with a negative charge. So the chlorine ion here would be an anion because it has a negative charge on it. These usually dissolve in the water that's in the soil because they interact with water molecules via the hydrogen bonding, okay, having to do with the properties of water. So once these anions are, dissolving in the soil water, they become the solute, and they're readily available to the plants for absorption. The problem is, since these are so easily dissolved in the water, if the soil is, not going to hold the water for a very long time, and it gets washed away by rain or any kind of erosion, we're going to lose those. So we call that leaching, leaching of the soil. So when we lose those anions due to water runoff, taking it away, this usually affects anions, at least where we live, it affects anions. The types of nutrients that contain positive charges are called cations, and I always have remembered this because there's a T in cations, and T kind of looks like a plus sign, and positive is plus. Cations have positive charges, and these also can dissolve in the soil water, but are not as immediately available as the anions. And the reason for this is because the cations are going to actually stick to clay soil. So clay soil is largely negative, so these cations are going to stick to the soil. Now, that's great because now this isn't going to be leached away as easily because it's going to be stuck to the soil. So as long as the soil's there, you're not going to lose your cations. Whereas with our anions, even though they were right there, they were easy to suck up, they were also easy to lose because they were getting pulled away with runoff and things like that. So cations are great because they stick around a little bit longer, but they're not as immediately available because of the fact that they're stuck to clay particles. Okay, so that's what this figure is showing you. So it's showing you, look at this clay soil, look at how negative the clay soil is. So all of our anions, all of these positive potassiums, whatever they may be, are all stuck to the clay soil. Whereas our anions are just floating around in the water. So if something, if it were to rain, all of these anions could be leached away, whereas the cations are stuck to the clay particles. Now there's a good video that I have available for you on Blackboard that kind of talks about this a little bit, and also talks about something called cation exchange, where in order for a root to take up the cation, it actually has to exchange a cation, a hydrogen ion, for it, which is kind of cool. So make sure you understand that concept and take a look at that video. So one of the things that affects how well these essential elements that are available and where we find them has to do with the pH of the soil, so how acidic or how basic the soil is. So acidic soils are found in regions where we have the conifer forest, so up in the Canada area, where decomposition of organic matter produces carbonic, phosphoric, and nitric acid. So now we're looking at cycling of nutrients, and we'll talk about this, I think, in the final chapter of this semester. We'll talk about the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. We're going to touch on it here. And alkaline soils are found in areas that are rich in limestone, calcium carbonate. So we'll see this greatly affecting the pH and how available essential elements are. So this is kind of an interesting figure here. You're looking at pH, 7 being kind of the neutral pH, and then as the soil gets more basic and more acidic, we can see what nutrients are best kind of suited for that soil. So where these bars are the thickest are where the soil is the most rich in those nutrients. So you see it's kind of concentrated here around the different nutrients that are available. So plants that need a whole lot of, are very dependent, let's say, on manganese more so than others, would want to grow in soils that have a pH around 5.5 and 6, right? Notice that nitrogen takes up a good span of it, but let's say a plant wanted to grow here, right? There's very low nitrogen, like that's not good. So it'd have to get nitrogen from somewhere else, okay? And there are plants that grow at that very low level of nitrogen. So things like Venus flytraps, they have to get their nitrogen from literally eating flies and insects to get that nitrogen because their soil is so nitrogen poor. All right, so very interesting figure here. So where does this take place on the root? So most nutrient uptake occurs just above the growing root tip. So we talked about this last chapter, in a region called the zone of maturation. So the zone of maturation is where nutrient uptake takes place in the plants. So in this region, the epidermal cells have root hairs, and as we know already, root hairs are going to increase surface area for absorption. So this is, where you have root hairs, you expect to have the most absorption. And around these root hairs, the zone of nutrient depletion is created in the soil. Okay, and that's where, you're going to see essentially all the nutrients from that area kind of sucked out. And then the roots hairs will grow to new areas as the availability of nutrients changes in the soil. So it makes sense then that the continuous growth of the root tip is going to be vital to the plant's health as this zone of nutrient depletion is going to spread, right? So you're going to need to move your roots out to get to places where there are nutrients as you deplete them in the area where you originally were. Right, so here you can see this, the root hairs very clearly in this seedling. There's where we talked about the actively dividing cells and the growth of the root, and then up here is where all the root hairs are, and that's where all of this absorption of nutrients is taking place. So one of the major evolutionary adaptations that have occurred to kind of help this process along involves the association between the mycorrhizae and plants. So fungi and plant roots live in this really amazing association, and over 80% of all vascular plant species have some degree of mycorrhizae. And this is proved to be very important and proved to be a very good adaptation. So this is mutualistic, meaning that both the plant and the fungi are benefiting. So the fungi get sugars from the plant, while the plants receive soil nutrients such as nitrogen from the fungi. So they kind of work together to provide the nutrients needed for each other. It also very much so increases the surface area of absorption. So what makes this so great? So fungi are really good at acquiring nutrients for two reasons. So again, the hyphae, network filamentous area that's created by this mutualistic relationship is going to increase the surface area for absorption by 700%. So it's really, really advantageous for the plants to increase their surface area that much. The fungi can acquire nutrients from macromolecules in soil that are unavailable to non-mycorrhizal plants. So they are available to take things that other plants are not able to get. Okay. So another important macronutrient, very important macronutrient, is nitrogen. So nitrogen gas makes up 80% of the atmosphere. All right, so It's readily available in the atmosphere, but the problem is we can't use nitrogen gas in that form. So N2 is not available for taking up. So in order to get nitrogen into the tissues, it has to be converted into a form that plants and animals can use. And that occurs through a process called nitrogen fixation. So a few species of bacteria are actually able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into ammonia, okay, NH3, nitrates, NO2, and nitrates, NO3. And that process is called nitrogen fixation. So specifically, these bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria are going to take care of that job, and they're going to do that. Plants specifically are going to take in nitrogen in the form of ammonium or nitrate. And lastly here, 99% of living plants are autotrophs, meaning that they can, create their own sugar through photosynthesis. The only exception to that would be these parasitic plants. But by definition, a plant is going to be doing photosynthesis. So 95% of vascular plants take up nutrients from the soil, 80% rely on that mycorrhizal mutualism. But like I said, there are ones that don't follow that rule. So plants that parasitize other plants and latch onto them, actually like mistletoe, isn't going to be doing its own photosynthesis. Some plants appear to live on air, right? And they do not, latch onto the soil. Those are called epiphytes. I'm surprised that just came into my head, that name. I was trying to think what it was, epiphytes. And some plants can catch and dissect insects. So like the pitcher plant and the Venus flytrap are going to get their nitrogen from insects and not from the soil. Okay. All right, so this will end this chapter, and I will see you next time.